Deep within the claustrophobic, politically supercharged epicenter of a Capitol Hill congressional hearing room, the atmospheric pressure was thick enough to be cut with a bone saw. The air conditioning struggled and ultimately failed to combat the sweltering body heat generated by a room packed well beyond its legal fire code capacity. In the center of this modern-day gladiatorial arena, Representative Ilhan Omar positioned herself at the polished mahogany witness table, expertly weaponizing her physical presence and rhetorical framing before a captive, fiercely divided national audience. She leaned forward, her shoulders squared, and leveled an accusatory, trembling finger directly at the face of Senator John Kennedy. Her voice rang out through the state-of-the-art amplification system, vibrating with the heavily practiced, theatrical indignation of a progressive vanguard attempting a merciless public execution on live, syndicated television. She had been granted unprecedented, highly irregular special questioning privileges for what was initially billed on the congressional docket as a routine, dry, and thoroughly bureaucratic hearing regarding international refugee resettlement policies and administrative logistics. However, every single seasoned journalist, hardened political operative, and cynical lobbyist crammed shoulder to shoulder into the sweltering room, understood unequivocally that this was a meticulously calculated, highly coordinated political ambush designed to break a conservative icon, branding the silver-haired, genteel Republican senator a living, breathing, unapologetic symbol of America's shameful, systemically prejudiced past. Omar launched a blistering, scorched earth offensive. She masterfully painted him as a dusty, irrelevant relic of a bygone, oppressive era who possessed absolutely zero moral authority to sit in judgment of her marginalized constituents, or the broader, complex immigrant experience in the 21st century. She fully, confidently expected him to physically and politically cower. She anticipated that he would shrink defensively under the crushing, viral-ready weight of her self-righteous fury, perhaps stammering out a weak, politically expedient apology that would be immediately clipped, packaged, and weaponized on social media platforms before the hearing even concluded. Instead, Senator Kennedy, projecting a picture of absolute, terrifyingly serene composure that bordered on the unnatural, slowly reached his hands forward. With agonizing, deliberate slowness, he casually opened a nondescript, heavily worn manila folder resting quietly on the polished wood of his desk. What unfolded over the next several agonizing, history-making hours would not merely generate sensational, fleeting headlines for the evening news cycle. It would be permanently, indelibly etched into the darkest annals of modern American political history as one of the most devastating, methodically brutal, and surgically precise cross-examinations ever broadcast to the American public, a quiet, unrelenting, and completely inescapable dismantling that would leave her carefully constructed career, her carefully curated public persona, and her closest, most powerful political alliances in total, unsalvageable, smoking ruins. Senator Kennedy, Omar's voice echoed through the high-fidelity microphones, heavy with venomous contempt, dripping with a visceral condescension that commanded the absolute attention of every camera in the room. You sit up there on your elevated dais in your expensive, custom-tailored suit with your folksy Southern drawl, pretending to care deeply about fundamental human rights, while your entire decades-long political career has been aggressively built on, systematically, intentionally excluding people exactly like me from participating in the American dream. The gallery instantly erupted into a deafening, chaotic, and aggressively partisan roar of validation. Progressive activists, who had braved the freezing, bitter Washington pre-dawn air for hours just to secure a coveted front-row seat to this highly anticipated, heavily promoted confrontation, cheered with wild, uninhibited abandon. Many in the tightly packed crowd wore brightly colored hijabs in a highly coordinated, visually striking display of unwavering political solidarity, holding aloft boldly painted, slogan-heavy cardboard signs declaring refugees welcome and no human is illegal, ensuring the television cameras had a perfect backdrop of grassroots resistance. Down in the designated press rows, the mainstream media correspondents were already feverishly hammering at their laptop keyboards, their breathless, sensationalized narratives of Kennedy's impending, humiliating defeat and Omar's triumphant, historic stand practically pre-written on their glowing screens, ready to be dispatched to major newsrooms across the country the moment the gavel fell. But Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana simply sat there, utterly unmoved by the deafening theatrical spectacle swirling around him. His signature silver hair was perfectly, immaculately styled. His trademark wire-rimmed glasses were perched deliberately, almost academically, on the precise bridge of his nose. He wore a sharp, meticulously tailored charcoal suit that certainly looked incredibly expensive and refined, yet it lacked the ostentatious, flashy, insecure flair of a man desperately trying to project unearned power. As Omar's relentless, machine gun attacks grew increasingly personal, vitriolic, and aggressively unbound by congressional decorum, the most observant political veterans and seasoned, cynical reporters in the room began to notice something deeply unsettling, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. A slight, almost imperceptible upturn at the very corner of Kennedy's mouth. It was a phantom smirk, a micro-expression suggesting with terrifying clarity that he was silently, immensely enjoying a private, devastatingly ruinous joke that the rest of the screaming room was fundamentally, tragically unequipped to understand. You have never known a single, solitary day of actual grinding struggle or systemic persecution in your entire, privileged life. Omar continued, her voice rising dramatically in pitch, practically vibrating with a highly practiced, deeply theatrical anger, specifically engineered for prime-time evening news, soundbites, and viral social media algorithms. You have never had to flee your beloved homeland in absolute, paralyzing terror in the dead of night. You have never spent agonizing, hopeless years wasting away in a squalid, disease-ridden refugee camp. You have never had to painstakingly, desperately build a life from absolute, ground zero nothing in a hostile country where powerful, entrenched people exactly like you view vulnerable people exactly like me as dangerous, existential threats to be ruthlessly eliminated, rather than as equal human beings to be welcomed, embraced, and protected. She paused dramatically, leaning back slightly in her heavy leather chair to bask in the warm, approving murmurs and scattered, defiant applause cascading down from her loyal, fiercely dedicated supporters in the gallery. Her chin was raised high in an unmistakable, iconic posture of absolute defiance and unassailable, unquestionable moral superiority. What could you possibly, conceivably know about the authentic, bleeding reality of the global refugee experience? What earthly, moral credentials possibly qualify you to sit up there in arrogant judgment of federal life-or-death policies affecting the absolute most vulnerable, marginalized, and desperate people on planet Earth? Throughout her entire blistering 10-minute tirade, Kennedy had not flinched, had not frowned, and had not interrupted. He simply continued to take meticulous, unhurried, perfectly spaced notes on the yellow legal pad resting squarely before him, his expression remaining maddeningly, impenetrably serene, like a seasoned poker player holding a royal flush while his opponent enthusiastically pushes all their chips into the center of the table. When Omar finally exhausted her breath, pausing heavily and clearly expecting him to be visibly rattled, desperately defensive, or perhaps aggressively, foolishly hostile, he slowly, deliberately looked up, placing his silver pen down onto the desk with a soft, distinct click that somehow echoed through the sudden lull in the room. To the sheer, unadulterated bewilderment of the entire committee, the press corps, and the hostile gallery, there appeared to be genuine, polite, almost grandfatherly warmth swimming in his pale, icy blue eyes. "Thank you kindly for that deeply passionate, highly articulate speech about struggle, hardship, and persecution, ma'am," Kennedy finally drawled, his voice a low, rumbling, perfectly modulated baritone. Each syllable was heavily measured, weighed for maximum impact, and securely, deceptively wrapped in an impenetrable, disarming layer of traditional, syrupy Southern courtesy. "You raise some mighty important, entirely valid points about the absolute necessity of understanding different lived experiences before rendering judgment. And speaking directly of lived experiences, perhaps we should take this unique public opportunity to explore yours just a bit more thoroughly for the benefit of the historical record." He reached out with both hands and slowly flattened the battered manila folder that had been sitting closed like a ticking, apocalyptic time bomb on the table. The committee room, which had just seconds prior been buzzing with the self-satisfied, arrogant whispers of progressive legislative aides and overconfident activists, suddenly grew unnervingly, suffocatingly quiet. The sudden, violent shift in atmospheric pressure was palpable. It was the heavy, breathless silence that immediately precedes a catastrophic hurricane making landfall. "You eloquently, powerfully mentioned building a life from absolutely nothing here in America," Kennedy continued, his voice dropping into a conversational, almost intimately inquisitive register as he reached a long finger into the folder and extracted a single, crisp, heavily redacted and officially stamped document, holding it gently between his fingers so the cameras could catch the official seals. "Let's systematically, chronologically discuss exactly how you built that specific, highly successful American life. Specifically, ma'am, let's talk in granular, documented detail about your marriage in the calendar year of 2009. For the very first time that entire morning, Omar's impenetrable, meticulously crafted mask of absolute, televised confidence flickered violently, immediately replaced by a fleeting, uncontrollable, deeply human shadow of genuine, visceral panic that the high-definition cameras captured in ruthless detail. "My personal, private family life has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the policy matters of this," she began to loudly, aggressively protest, her voice abruptly jumping an entire octave in sudden, defensive desperation, her hands flying up in a halting gesture. "Oh, but I assure you it absolutely does, ma'am," Kennedy interrupted. His tone remained incredibly gentle, deceptively soft, but it proved as immovable, cold, and unforgiving as a slab of polished granite. "You see, highly troubling, deeply persistent questions have been continuously, publicly raised regarding this particular, legally documented civil marriage to a Mr. Ahmed Noor," said Elmi. He paused deliberately, letting the unfamiliar, explosive name hang heavily in the frigid, heavily air-conditioned air of the committee room, his eyes scanning the text of the document before slowly, predatorily rotating his head to meet her terrified, wide-eyed gaze. "Your biological brother." The committee room instantly, violently exploded into pure, unadulterated, screaming chaos. Progressive supporters physically leapt from their wooden seats, their faces twisted in rage, aggressively pointing fingers and shouting unhinged, deafening accusations of systemic lies, right-wing racism, and blatant Islamophobia. Down in the pit, the entire press corps seemed to collectively inhale before frantically, violently hammering at their keyboards, desperate to capture the exact phrasing of the explosive, undeniably career-ending pivot unfolding in real time before their lenses. Up on the dais, several senior Democratic committee members, suddenly looking genuinely, horrifyingly blindsided and deeply, physically uncomfortable, furiously exchanged confused, panicked glances as the horrifying, sinking realization dawned on them that they had just proudly, blindly marched into a meticulously laid, inescapable political trap. Omar's face had violently, instantly drained of all its natural color, shifting rapidly from a portrait of defiant, righteous outrage to a state of completely frozen, deer-in-the-headlights, paralytic shock. "That is a disgusting, fully discredited, right-wing internet conspiracy theory that has been thoroughly, repeatedly, and conclusively debunked by independent fact-checkers," she snapped, desperately raising her voice, leaning into the microphone in a futile, frantic attempt to project unyielding, authoritative control over the rapidly rising, chaotic din of the panicked room. "Has it now? Has it truly been debunked?" Kennedy asked mildly, cocking his head slightly to the side like a curious professor as he casually reached back into the folder and pulled out a much thicker, heavily stapled stack of official, international papers. "Because, ma'am, I happen to hold in my right hand official, highly verified, sovereign educational records obtained directly, via official channels, from the United Kingdom. These documents formally, legally show that Mr. Elmi attended high school there, explicitly listing the exact same, highly specific father's name as uniquely appears on your own sworn federal refugee application documents filed with the United States government. Furthermore, just in case international records don't satisfy you, I am also in possession of sworn, legally binding, notarized affidavits from highly respected, established, long-standing members of the Minneapolis Somali community legally confirming, under strict penalty of state and federal perjury, the direct biological family relationship between the two of you. And perhaps most interesting of all," he paused once again, proving himself a masterful, merciless conductor of pacing, letting the agonizing, stretching silence become almost physically unbearable. I have successfully obtained municipal housing records, federal postal records, and local utility bills explicitly, undeniably showing that you, your cultural husband, Mr. Ahmed Hirsi, and your legal husband, Mr. Elmi, all simultaneously, continuously lived at the exact same specific residential address in Columbia Heights, Minnesota. The silence that violently slammed down on the room was so absolute, so heavy, and so suffocating, it was effectively deafening. Even Omar's most radical, aggressively ardent, historically unapologetic supporters had abruptly, involuntarily stopped shouting. Their brightly painted, defiant protest signs lowered an inch at a time, slowly sinking to the floor as the crushing, inescapable weight of the presented physical evidence materialized before them like a brick wall. "Now, ma'am," Kennedy continued, never once breaking his infuriatingly calm, conversational, devastatingly measured cadence. In most global cultures, it is considered mighty unusual, highly irregular, for a woman to cohabitate with both her husband and her biological brother under the exact same roof. But it is even more spectacularly, undeniably unusual when she is legally married to the brother in the eyes of the state government, but simultaneously actively filing federal tax returns jointly with the other man. He smoothly produced yet another highly visible, color-coded document, holding it up clearly, deliberately, for the massive battery of C-SPAN cameras to capture the bold black ink, the recognizable federal insignias, and the unmistakable signatures. These are your official, signed, finalized tax returns from the calendar, years 2014 and 2015. You filed jointly with Mr. Hirsi, legally claiming him as your spouse to the Internal Revenue Service, while simultaneously being legally formally married to Mr. Elmi. That, ma'am, is textbook, undeniable, felony tax fraud. But infinitely more importantly, if Mr. Elmi is indeed your biological brother, as the overwhelming, insurmountable mountain of circumstantial, physical, and testimonial evidence aggressively suggests, then we are looking directly at a massive, systemic, deeply coordinated case of federal immigration fraud, a severe, highly penalized federal crime involving a deliberate criminal conspiracy to help a family member illegally, fraudulently obtain United States citizenship and permanent residency through a fabricated, documented sham marriage. Omar finally located her voice, though it cracked pathetically, entirely lacking every single ounce of its earlier, commanding, righteous, booming strength. These are entirely fabricated, forged, doctored documents. This is absolutely nothing but a racist, politically motivated, coordinated right-wing attack specifically designed to destroy a woman of color, she stammered, gripping the wooden edges of the witness table so hard her knuckles turned a stark, bone white, her eyes darting frantically around the room looking for a lifeline that wasn't coming. "Ma'am," Kennedy interrupted with an exaggerated, agonizingly sharp, profoundly Southern politeness that cut cleanly through her rising hysteria like a freshly honed butcher's blade. "Mathematics isn't Islamophobic. Biological DNA is not inherently racist." And speaking directly, practically of DNA, he pulled out yet another heavily highlighted, meticulously filed page, holding it aloft. "This is a formal, documented, public request from the Daily Mail newspaper dated October 2019, formally, respectfully asking you to submit to a simple, entirely painless, highly standard DNA test to definitively, scientifically disprove these heinous, damaging allegations once and for all. You categorically, repeatedly, and aggressively refused multiple times. If Mr. Elmi truly, honestly isn't your brother, wouldn't a simple 5-second medical cheek swab instantly clear this entire unfortunate, ugly misunderstanding up immediately and restore your untarnished reputation to the American people? In the extreme blurred periphery of the camera frame, a senior, deeply panicked, highly influential Democratic committee member quietly, slowly reached up to her lapel, unpinned her brightly colored, previously mandatory I Stand with Ilhan solidarity button, and placed it face down, completely out of sight, on her polished wooden desk, staring rigidly straight ahead. Others in the Democratic bloc were frantically, desperately swiping at their smartphones under the table, their faces pale as ghosts as they presumably texted their chiefs of staff in a desperate, chaotic, real-time scramble to figure out exactly how quickly, safely, and cleanly, they could publicly distance themselves from the catastrophic, career-ending, radioactive implosion unfolding directly in front of their eyes. But rest assured, we are barely just getting started, Kennedy announced cheerfully, meticulously, almost happily squaring his towering, intimidating stacks of papers on the desk as if preparing for the highly anticipated, deeply dramatic second act of a grand, tragic Shakespearean play. Shall we gracefully continue exploring the intricate, deeply fascinating details of exactly how you've built your celebrated, highly publicized American success story? I deeply believe this committee, and the taxpayers watching at home, would be profoundly, intensely interested in taking a much closer, forensic look at your campaign finance activities. The arrogant, overly confident Hunter had definitively, irrevocably, and publicly become the terrified, cornered, hunted, and the suffocating, heavy, electrified atmosphere in the room confirmed that every single soul present knew it as absolute fact. The Southern gentleman with the disarming, gentle smile and the devastating, inescapable, highly organized arsenal of federally authenticated documents had merely casually finished his preliminary warm-up exercises. Kennedy casually adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, taking his time, and smoothly extracted an entirely new, heavily tabbed, meticulously indexed section from his seemingly bottomless, terrifying folder. This one was labeled in neat, clinical, unfeeling typescript. Campaign Finance, MyNet. Now, ma'am, let's thoroughly, honestly discuss your deeply intertwined, highly lucrative, and highly controversial professional relationship with Mr. Tim Minette and his prominent political consulting firm, the E Street Group, Kennedy began, his tone subtly shifting, darkening slightly, heavily suggesting that the horrors about to be unleashed would effortlessly dwarf the catastrophic, career-ending revelations they had just barely processed. Omar's two high-priced, heavily credentialed Washington insider defense lawyers immediately tensed, their professional composure shattering. One aggressively leaned in to whisper urgently into her ear, his hand covering his mouth to block lip readers, likely advising her to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights immediately. But she angrily, irrationally, and foolishly waved him off, a highly visible, glistening bead of cold sweat steadily, undeniably trailing down her temple for the macro lenses to capture. According to official, audited, publicly available Federal Election Commission financial records, Kennedy continued, his voice ringing with absolute, unassailable, mathematical clarity, your congressional campaign organization paid Mr. Minette's company approximately $370,000 in donor funds between the years 2018 and 2019. During this exact same, incredibly lucrative, highly profitable period, you were actively, secretly, engaging in a clandestine, extramarital, romantic affair with Mr. Minette. Is that timeline factually correct? Omar glared at him with a look of venomous, cornered, desperate hatred, her chest heaving visibly under the bright studio lights. My personal private relationships are absolutely not subject to congressional. They are absolutely, 100% subject to federal criminal scrutiny when American campaign funds, donated by hardworking citizens, are intimately, illegally, and systematically involved, Kennedy interrupted, the soft, forgiving velvet finally slipping completely from the forged, unforgiving iron in his voice. But rather than argue semantics with you, let's let someone entirely different, someone with first-hand knowledge, tell the story to the committee. He hoisted a massive, terrifyingly thick, officially bound, multi-hundred-page legal transcript into the air, dropping it onto the desk with a heavy, resounding, echoing thud that made several people jump. This is the sworn, legally binding, deeply tragic divorce deposition of Mrs. Beth Minette, given under strict penalty of perjury in the D.C. Superior Court system. Shall I read some of the more intensely relevant, highly descriptive portions aloud for the permanent congressional record? Without waiting for her consent or for her lawyers to formulate a baseless objection, he flipped the heavy document open to a heavily bookmarked page and began to read, perfectly mimicking the dry, devastated, hollow, heartbroken tone of an utterly betrayed spouse whose life had been destroyed. My husband told me directly, to my face, in April 2019 that he was having an ongoing affair with Congresswoman Omar. He blatantly confessed he'd been traveling heavily with her on supposed official campaign trips that I now firmly, based on the evidence, believe were entirely personal and deeply romantic in nature. When I explicitly, logically asked how on earth they could possibly afford all this luxury, high-end, international travel on a standard consultant's salary, he looked directly at me, without shame, and said, "Don't worry about it. Ilhan's campaign is covering everything. We have an arrangement." The room was once again completely paralyzed by a dead, horrified, suffocating, graveyard silence. Even the furiously typing, highly cynical reporters had completely frozen, their hands hovering uselessly, paralyzed over their keyboards, utterly mesmerized by the sheer, brazen, almost cinematic audacity of the political corruption being laid bare in such forensic detail. "But naturally, that's just her scorned, biased word against yours, right?" Kennedy asked rhetorically, a dangerous, predatory, highly intelligent twinkle igniting in his pale eyes. Except, he pulled out a glossy, perfectly organized, legally subpoenaed stack of printed financial receipts, spreading them like a fan. "Here are the exact, itemized credit card trails from those very specific trips. Intimate, highly expensive, multi-course romantic dinners for two in Nice, France, completely, totally paid for by the Omar for Congress's federal fund. A luxurious, multi-day, exclusive couples spa retreat nestled in the heart of Napa Valley, miraculously, entirely funded by small-dollar campaign coffers, lavish, top-tier, five-star hotel suites, specifically booked with a single king-sized bed in cities where absolutely zero official campaign events, town halls, or political fundraisers were ever scheduled on your public or private itinerary. All of it meticulously, unapologetically, and fraudulently billed to working-class Minnesota political donors who sent you $20 thinking they were supporting progressive policy. Those were entirely legitimate, standard, legally permissible campaign networking expenses, Omar protested weakly, leaning into the microphone. But her voice was so hollow, reedy, and weak, it sounded like it belonged to a completely broken, fading ghost rather than a sitting member of Congress. "Really? Is that your sworn testimony?" Kennedy countered instantly, the steel jaws of the trap springing shut with terrifying speed. "Because I happen to have something right here, obtained legally through discovery, that suggests a vastly, horrifyingly different reality." In a highly unorthodox move that drew genuine, audible, unscripted gasps of absolute shock from the hardened, jaded press corps, Kennedy retrieved his personal smartphone, tapped the screen twice, and seamlessly plugged it directly into the committee's amplified high-definition audio system. "This is a legally obtained, court-admitted text message voice note sent from Mr. Minette directly to his estranged wife, secretly recorded and officially submitted into hard evidence during their bitter, highly contested, highly public divorce proceedings." A frustrated, aggressive, profoundly arrogant male voice suddenly boomed through the overhead speakers, echoing off the majestic marble walls with crystal clarity. "Stop calling me about the damn money! I told you, Ilhan's campaign is paying for everything right now. They have deep pockets. Just be patient and keep your mouth shut until the divorce is final." Several people in the public gallery audibly gasped, a collective, involuntary intake of shocked breath that registered on the microphones, and one of Omar's own senior trusted congressional staffers, sitting directly behind her in the front row, simply put her face deeply into her trembling hands and didn't look up again, silently weeping for her completely destroyed, instantly radioactive career. "Campaign funds paying for everything," Kennedy repeated slowly, thoughtfully, letting the devastating, legally catastrophic, prison-carrying words marinate deeply in the minds of the shocked committee members and the millions watching at home. "That is mighty interesting, highly specific, highly incriminating language for legitimate, above-board, standard political consulting. Wouldn't you say, Congresswoman? But wait, don't answer yet, because I'm not even close to being done with this section." He leaned forward, the folksy, disarming Southern charm completely, utterly evaporating into a terrifying display of razor-sharp, lethal, unrelenting prosecutorial aggression. "Let's talk extensively about exactly what happened after your sordid, highly publicized, deeply controversial affair became public knowledge, and you officially, legally married Mr. Minette in March 2020. Did the exorbitant, highly questionable, Legally dubious campaign payments suddenly stop out of an abundance of ethical caution and a desire for transparency? Oh, heaven forbid. No, no, ma'am. They exponentially, aggressively, and shamelessly increased. He slammed down a massive new stack of printed, highlighted FEC financial disclosure records, the paper slapping the wood like a gunshot. Your congressional campaign proceeded to pay your brand new husband's company another staggering, almost incomprehensible $1.1 million in the calendar year 2020 alone, instantly transforming him practically overnight into one of the absolute highest-paid political consultants in the entire United States of America. Quite a generous, multi-million-dollar wedding gift, courtesy of your unsuspecting, hard-working political supporters who thought they were funding a revolution. He looked up, his gaze slowly, deliberately scanning the horrified, shell-shocked, pale faces of the Democratic committee members who were now visibly calculating the immense political fallout. Now, I'm just a simple, small-town country lawyer from the great state of Louisiana, but down where I come from, secretly using federal campaign funds to illegally, systematically enrich your clandestine lover and then subsequently your legal spouse is what we explicitly, legally call the criminal conversion of campaign funds for personal use. It is, unequivocally, a severe, highly prosecuted federal crime, punishable by years in federal prison. But the staggering, breathtaking tragedy of this corruption doesn't end there, because the fraud continued to evolve. Kennedy was clearly, undeniably enjoying the theatrical, flawless precision of his presentation as he drew out the next damning, intricately connected, financially complex sequence. Let's smoothly pivot to Mr. Minette's latest entrepreneurial venture, post-marriage. Are you intimately familiar with the corporate entity legally known as the Northside Wine Group, ma'am? Omar's face, already deathly pale and slick with a terrified cold sweat that ruined her makeup, went completely ashen, her dark eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak exits as if calculating the physical distance to freedom. I have absolutely zero involvement, financial or otherwise, in my husband's private, independent business dealings. No? You maintain that under oath? Well, let me forcefully, publicly, and permanently refresh your convenient, highly selective memory, Kennedy said, his voice rising in volume as he gestured sharply toward the back of the crowded, tense gallery. Mr. Naeem Maud, would you please do this committee the distinct honor of standing up so we can all see you? A well-dressed, middle-aged man sitting rigidly in the third row abruptly stood up, his face contorted with a lifetime of unbridled, visceral, world-shattering fury. Mr. Maud, a hard-working, tax-paying American citizen, invested $300,000 of his personal, hard-earned life savings into your husband's purported, highly touted, heavily marketed wine business after being personally, repeatedly, and legally guaranteed a massive 200% financial return in exactly 18 months. That was 3 long, agonizing, financially ruinous years ago. He hasn't seen a single, solitary penny of that money since the day he foolishly signed the check. In fact, Kennedy consulted a highlighted, deeply detailed forensic accounting ledger prepared by federal investigators. Mr. Minette explicitly, illegally used that exact $300,000 injection of investor capital, Mr. Maud's money, to help fund the purchase of a sprawling $1.3 million luxury mansion located right here in Washington, D.C., the very same opulent, high-security home where you currently lay your head at night. That's a horrific, coordinated, deeply racist right-wing lie. A desperate, panicked, highly emotional activist in the gallery blindly shouted, desperately trying to protect the rapidly collapsing, heavily funded progressive narrative. But it was Maud himself who roared back, his voice echoing off the majestic marble pillars with the raw, terrifying power of a completely broken man who had nothing left to lose. No. The lie was looking me dead in the eye, shaking my hand, and telling me my money was for a legitimate, operational winery, Maud shouted. Hot, bitter tears of profound rage and absolute betrayal springing to his eyes, his hands balled into tight fists. She absolutely knew they bought that mansion with my hard-earned money, with my children's dedicated, entire college fund. Capitol security officers instantly, aggressively moved in to physically restrain him, their heavy hands reaching for his shoulders, preparing to eject him. But Kennedy raised a commanding, authoritative, unyielding hand, freezing the guards instantly in their tracks. Let the man speak. He is the genuine, undeniable, financial victim in this room today. They showed me intricately forged corporate contracts, completely fake, fabricated, beautifully printed wine inventories that didn't exist. Maud continued, his voice breaking, cracking with the total devastation of a financially ruined father. Tim Minette looked at me in my own home and explicitly, repeatedly said his wife's immense, unparalleled congressional power would absolutely ensure the business succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. He told me, and I quote, "Having a sitting, highly visible, powerful congresswoman as a senior, silent partner absolutely guarantees highly lucrative, exclusive government contracts for all our corporate events. I trusted them purely, entirely, and solely because of her federal position and the trust the public placed in her. Thank you for your immense courage in being here today, Mr. Maud. I know how painful this is," Kennedy said softly, respectfully, offering a small nod of genuine sympathy. "You may sit down." He slowly, menacingly rotated his heavy leather chair back to face the crumbling, hyperventilating congresswoman, who looked as though she might physically collapse. "Fascinating that your husband explicitly, repeatedly invoked your federal authority, your name, and your office to deliberately defraud innocent, hard-working investors out of their life savings. But of course, you maintain you knew absolutely nothing about it, right? You were entirely in the dark?" He didn't even wait for her inevitable, hollow, legally perilous denial before pulling out another officially stamped, publicly filed government document. "Except, ma'am, here is your legally mandated, sworn Congressional Financial Disclosure Form for the fiscal year 2023. Under strict, severe penalty of federal perjury, you formally, legally reported massive personal income derived directly from the Northside Wine Group in the staggering amount of between $100,000 and $1 million. You actively, knowingly profited immensely from your husband's malicious, highly illegal, devastating financial fraud, ma'am. In the eyes of the federal law and the Department of Justice, that firmly, undeniably establishes you as a criminal accessory after the fact." One of Omar's high-priced, desperately panicked, sweating defense attorneys leaped up, his heavy wooden chair scraping violently, loudly against the hardwood floor. "Senator, I must vehemently, categorically, and formally object to these totally unfounded, defamatory, completely outrageous, and legally unproven accusations being aired in this venue." "Unfounded?" Kennedy shot back instantly, his voice cracking like a heavy bullwhip as he yanked a final, fatal, legally binding document from the section. "This is a sprawling, multi-million-dollar, heavily detailed civil racketeering lawsuit filed just last week in the D.C. Superior Court. Mr. Maud is officially, legally suing your client and her husband for systemic financial fraud, egregious breach of contract, and severe civil RICO violations. Furthermore, I have it on excellent authority that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has formally opened a sprawling, multi-state criminal probe based on interstate wire fraud and money laundering. Did your client bother to tell you that highly pertinent fact, counselor, before you agreed to represent her on national television?" The lawyer's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle ticking in his cheek, and he slowly, defeatedly sank back into his expensive leather seat, without uttering another solitary syllable, the professional fight completely, entirely drained from his body as he realized his client had lied to him. "So, let's quickly, comprehensively, and clearly recap this highly celebrated American success story for the folks watching at home," Kennedy said, his voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered, pure disgust as he meticulously organized the catastrophic paper trail into a neat pile. "You used small-dollar donor money to illegally, secretly fund a lavish extramarital affair. You funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars to your lover's private company, and after marrying him, you escalated that staggering corruption to millions of dollars. You used campaign funds to illegally, fraudulently pay a divorce attorney to legally separate from your own biological brother so you could legally marry the man you were currently paying with donor cash, and you are currently living in a sprawling, million-dollar mansion directly funded by a fraudulent, predatory financial scheme that you actively, personally, and legally financially benefit from on your tax returns. You haven't just casually broken the law, ma'am. You have effectively, methodically, and with malice aforethought transformed your congressional campaign into a highly sophisticated, taxpayer-subsidized, incredibly lucrative criminal enterprise." Before Omar could even attempt to piece together a coherent, televised, legally sound defense, Kennedy's demeanor shifted noticeably yet again, completely shedding the gentle mockery and the righteous indignation over financial crimes, replacing it with a cold, terrifyingly serious, stone-faced gravitas that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. He adjusted his glasses slowly and stared a hole straight through the trembling, utterly destroyed Congresswoman. "Now, ma'am, we need to address a far darker, infinitely more dangerous, deeply rooted sickness. We need to meticulously, honestly, and painfully discuss your extensive, documented public and private statements regarding Jewish Americans and the sovereign state of Israel," he began, his voice carrying the heavy, mournful, crushing weight of a prosecutor addressing a profound, historical, moral rot rather than mere, common financial corruption. These are not merely standard, acceptable political policy disagreements over the incredibly complex geopolitics of the Middle East. They are the absolute bedrock of a sinister, systemic, deeply embedded pattern of racial and religious hatred that strikes directly at the very heart of your fundamental, basic fitness to serve in the United States Congress. He pulled out a large, beautifully color-printed, rigidly mounted screenshot, holding it up like an exhibit in a murder trial. Let's start with February 2019. After Representative Kevin McCarthy accurately, fairly criticized your vocal, unwavering support for the deeply anti-Semitic BDS movement, you casually, flippantly, and arrogantly tweeted, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." When pressed aggressively, repeatedly by journalists on who exactly you believed was secretly, illegally paying American politicians to be pro-Israel, you smugly, arrogantly, without hesitation responded, "AIPAC." Do you clearly, consciously recall making those highly publicized, deeply offensive statements? Omar's lawyers were frantically, desperately whispering in her ears, practically begging her to invoke the Fifth Amendment and remain entirely silent, but she offered a slight, deeply trembling, pathetic nod of her head. "I apologized for that tweet, yes. Only after enormous, unprecedented, deeply embarrassing public pressure from your own terrified party leadership," Kennedy interrupted sharply, slicing through her weak excuse like paper. "But forced, politically expedient, heavily drafted PR, apologies do not erase the dark, festering, hateful sentiment behind the words themselves. You deliberately, consciously, invoked one of the oldest, bloodiest, most dangerous, and historically lethal anti-Semitic tropes in human existence, the toxic, historically murderous lie that Jewish people use dark money to covertly control global politics and buy governments. And tragically, horribly, this was not an isolated slip of the tongue by a political novice." He held up another printed, highly highlighted page. "You see, we've legally obtained, through rigorous cyber forensics, a vast, terrifying, highly comprehensive archive of your rapidly deleted tweets. Did you know, ma'am, that when you delete a hateful tweet in a midnight panic, it's never truly gone, especially when the internet captures it first? This is from January 2019, a full calendar month before your infamous Benjamins comment. You brazenly, confidently wrote, 'AIPAC owns Congress. They buy politicians like groceries. Time to expose the puppet masters.' You desperately deleted this within minutes of posting it, but the digital footprint remains forever etched in stone." Gasps of absolute, unfiltered, sickening horror echoed from the Democratic side of the committee. Several prominent Jewish Democrats looked physically nauseated, their faces tight with profound, deep betrayal, intense anger, and absolute shock, realizing the true extent of the bigotry they had been pressured to excuse. "Puppet masters?" Kennedy repeated slowly, letting the incredibly ugly syllables drag like heavy iron chains across a stone floor. Yet another classic, deeply dangerous, historically weaponized anti-Semitic image, Jews depicted as shadowy, parasitic, evil, stateless controllers pulling the hidden strings of global society behind closed doors to manipulate the masses. But surely, your most ardent, devoted defenders claimed, this was just poor word choice from an inexperienced political novice, right? The senator reached deep into his folder and extracted a small, black digital audio recorder, holding it up delicately, like a highly radioactive, highly dangerous piece of physical evidence. This highly verified, authenticated digital audio file originates from a highly exclusive, private, high-dollar campaign fundraiser held securely in Minneapolis in March 2019. One of your own high-dollar, fiercely progressive donors was so profoundly, deeply disturbed by the vile, hateful, unvarnished nature of your unscripted speech that they secretly recorded it on their phone and eventually turned it over to federal investigators out of sheer, undeniable, overwhelming moral obligation to their country. He pressed the play button, and Omar's own unmistakable, self-assured, incredibly arrogant voice flooded the cavernous room, completely and permanently stripping away any lingering shred of plausible deniability. The Jewish members of Congress, they can't be trusted on anything related to the Middle East. They have deep, ingrained, divided loyalties. They always, inherently put Israel first and America second. We need to watch them carefully and relentlessly, aggressively counter their dangerous, outsized influence in our government. The recording continued to hiss, projecting into the room for another agonizing, career-ending, excruciating minute, each sentence a more damning, explicitly bigoted, unapologetic indictment than the last, until Kennedy finally, mercifully clicked it off. The entire room sat in stunned, suffocating, completely paralyzed silence, collectively grappling with the sheer, undeniable, breathtaking ugliness of the raw bigotry that had just been exposed. "Dual loyalty accusations," Kennedy said quietly, his voice echoing loudly in the dead, intensely tense air. The exact same lethal, horrific, baseless accusations used to systematically, legally justify the bloody, merciless pogroms in Tsarist Russia, the deeply shameful Dreyfus affair in France, and the horrific, unimaginable, industrial-scale dawn of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. You blatantly, openly, and comfortably accused your own democratic Jewish colleagues of being treasonous traitors to the United States of America solely, exclusively because of their religious heritage and ethnic background. That audio is aggressively, unfairly, and maliciously taken out of context, Omar protested weakly, her voice trembling violently, though even she seemed to finally realize how pathetically absurd and utterly useless the defense sounded in the immediate face of her own recorded, verified words. The context makes it infinitely, immeasurably worse. Kennedy shot back without missing a single beat, brandishing the full, verified, multi-page transcript in the air. Should I play the full, unedited 10-minute recording right now? For the entire world to hear, where you progressively spiral into outright conspiracy, claiming that Jewish dark money entirely dictates American foreign policy and that the progressive movement must forcefully, physically break their grip on power by any means necessary. Would that additional context assist your defense, ma'am? Do you want me to hit play? Two highly respected Jewish committee members abruptly stood up, their faces pale with profound grief and righteous, deeply personal rage, and walked straight out of the room, one of them visibly, openly wiping hot tears of betrayal from her eyes. The crushing, absolute moral weight of the exposure was systematically, deliberately, and surgically breaking the entire room in half. But Kennedy was absolutely unrelenting, operating with the terrifying, cold efficiency of a highly tuned machine. He laid out a sprawling, undeniable, incredibly complex web of financial documents, directly connecting her congressional campaign to radical extremist groups like care organizations with heavily documented, federal court-proven, historical and financial ties to the Holy Land Foundation, and massive, global Hamas terror funding network. He slammed down high-resolution, time-stamped photographs of Omar smiling warmly, shaking hands, and laughing beside known, designated Hamas operatives at Qatari-funded, high-society events, exposing the breathtaking, sickening, absolute hypocrisy of a woman who loudly decried Jewish money in politics while happily, greedily stuffing her campaign coffers with illicit, dark donations from foreign, sovereign entities that openly, actively, and proudly sponsored global terror against American allies. Then, Kennedy reached for the thickest, most ominous, heavily guarded section of his massive folder, his entire physical demeanor transforming into something much colder, infinitely harder, and terrifyingly precise. The genteel, disarming, folksy Southern courtesy vanished entirely, completely replaced by the grim, unforgiving, heavily burdened aura of a federal prosecutor about to deliver the final, lethal, inescapable closing argument in a capital murder trial. He slowly turned his icy gaze away from the ruined, trembling congresswoman and looked up directly, respectfully, into the gallery, where a solemn, completely silent group of men and women sat tightly together in the very front row. They wore simple, heartbreaking, beautifully crafted pins bearing the faded, precious photographs of loved ones who had been violently, instantly vaporized 25 years ago in the dust, fire, and twisting steel of Lower Manhattan. "Before we proceed to this final, exceedingly grave matter," Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a near, reverent whisper that immediately commanded absolute, pin-drop silence from every single soul in the room, "I want to humbly, respectfully acknowledge the 9/11 families who have traveled so far to be here today. I know, in my bones, that the sheer, unvarnished depravity of what we are about to discuss will be deeply, profoundly, and agonizingly painful to hear, but the American people have a sacred, unalienable right to understand exactly who sits in the hallowed, powerful halls of their Congress and makes laws in their name." He turned his devastating gaze back to Omar, who had visibly paled even further, looking almost translucent, her breath hitching audibly at the mere mention of 9/11, her dark eyes darting like a trapped, terrified animal looking for an exit that didn't exist. "In March 2019, you delivered a fiery, highly publicized keynote address at a CARE fundraising banquet. And in that speech, surrounded by your supporters, you uttered a phrase that permanently, irrevocably, and truly revealed the dark, rotting, fundamentally anti-American core of your true feelings regarding the most catastrophic, bloody, and devastating terror attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor." Kennedy picked up a digital tablet and seamlessly cast the high-definition, professionally recorded video feed onto the massive, state-of-the-art committee screens mounted securely on the walls. Omar's lawyers frantically, desperately shouted legally baseless, procedural objections, screaming about committee rules and point of order, but the committee chairman, utterly exhausted, deeply disgusted, and fully sensing the grim, undeniable historical weight of the moment unfolding before him, ruthlessly, loudly gavelled them down into silence. On the massive screens, a triumphant, beautifully dressed, beaming Omar stood confidently at a podium before a roaring, supportive crowd. Her voice blasted through the room, chilling everyone present to the absolute bone. "CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties." Kennedy violently, abruptly paused the video, the high-definition image freezing perfectly on her smiling, arrogant, self-satisfied face. "Some people did something," Kennedy repeated, the words tasting like highly toxic bitter ash in his mouth. "That is exactly, specifically how you consciously chose to describe the savage, premeditated, barbaric, and utterly merciless murder of 2,977 innocent American citizens, not radical Islamic terrorists, not a catastrophic, highly coordinated, deeply evil act of war against our great, grieving nation. Some people did something. You described it exactly as if it were a minor, unfortunate traffic dispute, a trivial, deeply irrelevant historical footnote, barely worth describing accurately to your audience." He let the horrific, undeniable minimization hang in the air like a heavy, sharp guillotine blade, before pulling out a brand new, highly documented stack of papers. "But your defenders, your highly paid media allies, and your political shields claimed you simply misspoke in the heat of the moment, that it was a gaffe. Except, ma'am, I have right here a newly unearthed, fully authenticated, verbatim transcript from a Minnesota Public Radio interview conducted in 2013, 6 full years earlier, where you callously, coldly stated that America's military actions created the justified, inevitable conditions for retaliation. And furthermore, I have deleted, highly verified, time-stamped posts from a Somali-language internet forum posted on the exact, somber anniversary of the attacks where you viciously, cruelly mocked grieving Americans for overreacting to 9/11, claiming they use it purely as a convenient, fabricated excuse for global imperialism. In the gallery, the 9/11 families were openly, uncontrollably weeping, tightly clutching the laminated photos of their dead children, spouses, and parents to their chests. Suddenly, an elderly man, his face deeply weathered by decades of unimaginable, soul-crushing grief, stood up, his voice shaking with a righteous, deeply American rage that physically shook the room. "My daughter died burning in the flames of the North Tower. She was 23 years old. She was not a statistic. She was not some people," he screamed, his voice breaking into a sob. Kennedy raised a gentle, deeply comforting hand toward the man. "Sir, I deeply, profoundly understand your immeasurable pain. Please, I beg you, let me finish this. She is going to answer for every single hateful word. Kennedy turned back to the shrinking, utterly defeated Congresswoman, retrieving a final stack of authenticated, heavily encrypted WhatsApp messages intercepted directly from a 2019 group chat with radical anti-American political activists. In this private, secure chat discussing the massive public fallout from your vile comments, you explicitly, sociopathically wrote, "The American obsession with 9/11 is highly useful for us. Use their deep national guilt against them. Every time they question us, immediately bring up Islamophobia. Make them feel incredibly bad for their aggressive reaction rather than the attack itself. It works every time." The room completely, utterly detonated. Democrats who had desperately, loyally tried to remain stoic and professional could no longer contain their absolute, visceral disgust. One senior member shouted, "That is absolutely, fundamentally unconscionable," directly into a hot, live microphone, not caring for a second who heard him or what the political ramifications would be. You viewed the agonizing, fiery slaughter of thousands of innocent Americans not as a towering, world-shaking human tragedy, but as a highly convenient, manipulative, deeply sociopathic political tool to advance your own career, Kennedy growled, pulling out the final, fatal, legally binding document bearing a massive, embossed federal seal. And because of this undeniable fact, because you brazenly, arrogantly told federal agents directly during your official security clearance review that America essentially deserved 9/11, the Director of National Intelligence has just handed down an emergency, entirely unprecedented, immediate executive order. Kennedy read from the seal-stamped paper, his voice booming with the full, unchecked authority of the United States government. Effective immediately, Representative Ilhan Omar's high-level federal security clearance is permanently, irrevocably, and completely revoked. She is immediately barred from all classified briefings, removed from all intelligence committees, and physically, legally denied access to all secure federal facilities nationwide. Omar's lawyers jumped up screaming, frantically attempting to physically shield her from the cameras. But Kennedy simply raised his voice, drowning their pathetic, baseless objections in the inescapable, crushing truth. "Your political career is completely, permanently over, ma'am. Not because of your religion, not because of your race, but because you are a staggering, unapologetic fraud, a brazen, highly coordinated thief, and a vile terrorist sympathizer who maliciously, criminally conned your way into the United States Congress." The immediate, sprawling aftermath was a scene of absolute, apocalyptic, unprecedented political destruction, a biblical, wrathful reckoning playing out live on national television for the entire world to witness. As heavily armed, highly disciplined Capitol Police officers formally, rigidly marched into the committee room to physically, publicly strip the disgraced, weeping Congresswoman of her secure federal credentials, the very foundation of her carefully constructed political shielding entirely disintegrated before her wide, terrified eyes. Kennedy, completely ignoring her desperate, tearful, entirely hollow screams of a racist witch hunt, calmly projected a barrage of newly leaked, highly damaging text messages from her most fiercely loyal, highly visible progressive allies directly onto the giant committee screen. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the highly celebrated progressive vanguard, had privately, desperately texted Ayanna Pressley just weeks prior to the hearing. "Ilhan is becoming a massive, uncontrollable liability. Her toxic, unhinged hatred is actively, permanently destroying our entire movement. We need to completely cut her loose and distance ourselves immediately before she drags us all down into the dirt with her." Rashida Tlaib had sent similar, deeply panicked, angry messages, bitterly complaining that Omar's virulent, uncontrollable anti-Semitism was deeply embarrassing her own Palestinian constituents and threatening her re-election. The squad hadn't just abandoned her in her moment of need. They had been actively, ruthlessly, and politically plotting her complete assassination for weeks to save their own lucrative, powerful careers. The final, crushing nail was driven violently into the political coffin when Congressman Jerry Nadler, acting with the full, unprecedented, highly publicized, and fully coordinated blessing of Speaker Nancy Pelosi herself, formally entered a sweeping, historic resolution demanding Omar's immediate, unconditional resignation and permanently stripping her of all remaining minor committee assignments, firmly declaring on the record that her documented, deliberate, and highly calculated anti-Semitism could no longer, under any circumstances, be excused as mere ignorance or mistranslation. The Southern gentleman calmly, methodically packed his battered, world-changing manila folder, nodded deeply and respectfully to the weeping, grateful 9 over 11 families in the front row, and quietly walked out of the chaotic, screaming room, leaving the total, smoking, unsalvageable ruin of a corrupt, fraudulent political empire in his wake. In the highly tense days that immediately followed, the deafening, total silence from the mainstream media apparatus and the powerful Democratic establishment spoke absolute volumes. They dropped her like a spent, highly radioactive cartridge, proving definitively to the entire nation that their highly touted political loyalty was entirely, selfishly transactional, based solely on her usefulness as a political human shield rather than any genuine, deeply held moral conviction or shared values. But John Kennedy had not merely destroyed Ilhan Omar that day. He had simply unlocked a massive, incredibly heavy, rust-covered door that could never, ever be closed again. And as the dust finally, slowly settled over the stunned, paralyzed, paranoid capital city, deep within the labyrinthine, heavily guarded, windowless corridors of the Department of Justice, a highly secure federal printer whirred to life in the absolute dead of night. A single, heavily redacted, highly classified grand jury subpoena slid smoothly into the output tray, bearing a name no one in Washington had yet dared to whisper aloud, a highly recognizable name that terrifyingly suggested the sprawling, complex web of financial corruption and foreign terror funding went far, far higher up the Democratic chain of command than anyone in that sweltering hearing room could have possibly, in their wildest nightmares, imagined. The file had been opened, the brutal, unvarnished facts laid bare for the world. But the true, earth-shattering, historic political bloodbath was only just beginning to violently tick down to zero,